Welcome to the first of our webinar series on reducing uncertainties and raising awareness of clean fuels. We are pleased to present today's webinar focused on urban transit buses with Michael McDonald and Joey Cyples. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the work we do spans across many nations. We respectfully acknowledge the space our organization is headquartered in includes the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The lands are also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. We share these acknowledgements in a spirit of truth, justice, and reconciliation. Our webinar series looks at alternative fuels for different vehicle classes and ask panelists with real-world experience their perspective on the transition and how they perceive the challenges and opportunities. There are multiple options out there for operators, and we want to bring some clarity into this space. We will open today's webinar, which focuses on urban transit buses, by having the panelists respond to our key question, followed by some moderator questions. We will then open the floor to the audience for questions. Please make sure to submit all questions for the panelists in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter any technical difficulties, don't hesitate to send a message in the chat, and one of our team members will be available to help. Lastly, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded for future reference. I'm pleased to present our panelists for today's webinar. First, we have Michael McDonald, who joined NFI Group in 2017 and has since assumed the role of Operations Manager for the Vehicle Innovation Center. Michael lends strategic vision and guidance to VIC programming, outreach, R&D, electric bus demonstrations. He also speaks regularly on EV technology, sustainability, and infrastructure at industry conferences across the US and Canada. Next, we have Joey Cyples, who's a chartered professional accountant and has worked for Enbridge for 10 years. He has held several positions at Enbridge in finance, audit, and business development. He advocates for sustainable energy solutions, specializing in alternative fuels like CNG, LNG, RNG, and hydrogen for medium and heavy-duty fleets. At the forefront of reducing carbon emissions, his role involves guiding clients through business case analysis, fuel procurement, and providing tailored solutions. So I would like to begin by asking our panelists the key overarching question for this webinar. Now, we know that ECCC is in consultations with agencies and stakeholders regarding implementation of a sales mandate for zero emissions vehicles, which will include buses. Many transit agencies also have internal mandates to purchase zero emission buses. This will require electrification or hydrogen, with electrification probably taking the most market share. So I just want to open this question to our panelists by asking them what role they think alternative fuels will play during the transition to zero emission vehicles. Michael.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is a great key question to kick off our conversation today. I guess I'll probably start by saying that I'm not so sure I agree that electrification, or I guess the battery electric model, is necessarily going to be the champion in market share. Certainly, with all of our experience right now working in the transit bus space, that's definitely been the case for a number of reasons. First of all, being the simple availability of electricity. Most, at least on a smaller scale, most places have access to electricity, obviously, and then just the proliferation and the progress being made in the technological advancement of batteries and available batteries. A lot of that isn't just driven by the EV space, but is also driven by the proliferation of personal electronics like smartphones and tablets and everything that everybody seems to have now. Just the massive volumes have really drawn key progress for energy density and other figures of merit there. So I think for that reason, that's one of the reasons why it seems like battery electric is really kind of come off as a champion. But I do think that the dust is still settling on this. We have other technologies, especially in the bus world, where we consider ourselves being propulsion agnostic, where hydrogen and other clean fuels are being considered. And even though they are smaller scale, we're really seeing the ramp up there. And that's because I think all of these fuel types, all of them have their pluses and minuses. And all of those pluses and minuses and pros and cons are going to have to do with what you're trying to accomplish and what alternatives you have in play in your specific geographic location. So I really think that it is still kind of an open-ended question, and there's a chance it could be, you know, a 50-50 kind of situation when the dust actually does settle. But we're right in the middle of that transition right now, and we're seeing a lot of stuff out there in the field.
Thank you. Joey?
Yeah, I echo many of Michael's comments. I think it's about finding a balance and multi-pronged approach. We don't see RNG or hydrogen as alternatives to electrification. They can complement each other. An example is using renewable natural gas for resiliency of an electrical system. It can be used. You know, if the electric system goes down, you can burn renewable natural gas and provide, you know, green electricity to an electric fleet. But the other piece on particularly the renewable natural gas, we're seeing a lot of activity on the municipal sector, specifically here in Ontario. We have a landfill issue. The Ontario Waste Resources Association says Ontario has now less than 10 years until there's no more landfill capacity in the province. A big reason for this is 1/3 of the tonnage that goes into a landfill is organic waste. So how do you divert this organic waste? You put into an anaerobic digester, and you can make renewable natural gas, kind of creating that circular economy. An example of this would be the City of Toronto, that has a green bin program, is picking up organic waste, putting into an anaerobic digester, and making fuel for their own fleet. Hydrogen's a compelling option. You know, despite the challenges in infrastructure and production costs, we're starting to see a lot of technological advancements. I think we're going to start seeing hydrogen more increasingly viable. But, you know, kind of in summary, everyone's looking for that silver bullet, but it's going to take a portfolio of solutions here. Whether it's, you know, you're not able to get the electricity, maybe you have routes that you may have to buy more than one bus to offset those routes, where, you know, these multiple technologies can kind of complement each other rather than compete against each other.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I could press you a little bit on that. I think, you know, so Joey, you've mentioned the energy, you know, flexibility. Could talk a little bit more about the advantages as you see it for natural gas and hydrogen as opposed to electrification for buses.
Yeah, for sure. Some advantages with electric charging. Yeah, there's options for on-route charging. There's a lot of complications around that. Routes change, I think, you know, every 4 years or so. So municipalities are worried about stranded assets. So that brings now to overnight charging. With renewable natural gas or hydrogen buses, you can refuel in minutes, not hours. We partnered with the City of Hamilton, who's building a new natural gas transit garage. They're going to be able to refill 4 buses in 5 minutes simultaneously. So you kind of get the buses in and out very quickly. Capital costs, a natural gas bus is, you know, maybe $50,000-$60,000 more than a diesel bus, not, you know, double the amount. But a big piece is carbon intensity. You know, everyone focuses on tailpipe emissions when we should be looking at life cycle emissions. An electric bus in Ontario that has very clean electricity doesn't have zero emissions. Ontario's grid isn't, you know, 100% renewables. An electric bus in Ontario produces around 14,000 kilograms of CO2 per year. However, using renewable natural gas, you can get to net zero or carbon negative. State of California is now at the point where their entire RNG supply for fleet fuel is minus 100 grams per megajoule of carbon dioxide equivalent. So, you know, and the other piece is there's a gaseous stream. So you make an investment in natural gas transit. It sets up very well for hydrogen. A lot of the garage modifications that you'd make for natural gas, you have to do the same ones for hydrogen. So you're kind of future-proofing a technology. So that'd be some of the advantages I could see on the gaseous side over battery electric.
Yeah, then I'll chime in a little bit. Definitely agree with everything that Joey said. I'll add a couple points too. As far as the bus is concerned, the sheer number of kilowatt hours that you can fit on. Joey, you mentioned, in a lot of cases for some agencies, you might have some routes that are a bit longer, a little bit more energy intense, where battery electric doesn't cut it, and so you can complement it with a something that's a little bit better on the energy density side. And so certainly a hydrogen and CNG or RNG can meet that and make that complement. You mentioned the fast refuel times. That's a big deal for fleets, who are not only very bottom line oriented, but everything has to go out at a certain time. Everything is very heavily focused on reliability and meeting service. So it's a business, and we need to be able to meet that with the technologies that we employ. As far as the kind of the differences between CNG/RNG as well as hydrogen, definitely one of the advantages if you're going to go a carbon-based route with CNG or RNG, you get to leverage existing conventional technologies. So the engine, the conventional drivetrain, the way that you store the fuel, a lot of it is very similar to what you're doing already. And so you get to take advantage of a workforce that's already well trained in maintaining those aspects, and just finding parts availability, everything like that is definitely a simplification, both in the complexity as well as the associated costs with that. Now with hydrogen, you get it's sort of a pluses and minus sort of thing, because you don't get to take advantage of those things that I had just said, but you also get now an electric drivetrain, which has its own benefits, especially as it relates to efficiency. So you can look at both of them as being transition technologies, especially hydrogen more towards the electric side, and CNG more towards the hydrogen side. And there's a lot of interplay between the skill sets that you need and the basic infrastructure that you need in order to be able to run these at the fleet level.
Okay. I would like to ask a little bit then about the state of the technology, right? In the sense of, I think, Joey, you mentioned about electricity in Ontario is not fully renewable, but most of it is in Quebec and BC. Even more of it is renewable. So generation of clean electricity, in a sense, is a solved problem, and we know how to distribute it. I'm not sure that's the same for distribution of natural gas or even for hydrogen. Both present in terms of the state of infrastructure today. Both present real challenges with generation and distribution. Those are things we're still working on. So for a transit agency that's looking to make decisions today and to try to meet mandates by 2030 or whatever it is, how should they be thinking about pros and cons of these different fuels and buses, and how should they consider these challenges?
Yeah, I can start off. Yeah, I would challenge you a little bit on the clean electricity piece. I'm based in Ontario. Yeah, Ontario has a very clean grid. However, the ISO in 2022 has the APO report, and it looks at marginal emission factor. So right now you're at around 0.37 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour in that's forecast out to 2026. However, going out to 2039, they're anticipating it to be 0.52 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. And a big piece of this is the natural gas peak shavers are going to be used a lot more. Especially, it's going to take a while. Pickering is going to be refurbished. Then clean electricity is going to have to be offset. So I would say there's some challenges too on the clean electricity piece. The renewable natural gas, Canada has certainly been slower in the development compared to our partners south of the border. We're seeing a lot of activity here in Ontario. There's around 17 million diesel liter equivalents of renewable natural gas currently in production. Under construction, we have another 105 million diesel liter equivalents. So in the next year or two, that'll be coming onto the system. We have another 35 million that have been approved. And in our sales pipeline, we have another 30 to 50 RNG projects. So we're seeing a lot of advancement in the renewable natural gas production side. The clean fuel standard being rolled out is going to push this even further. A big reason why this takes off in the US is fleets have the ability to the RINs market, and in California, the LCFS. So the clean fuel standard, we have a similar credit type market now here in Canada, and then you add in the BC LCFS. So we're going to see a huge drive of the renewable natural gas actually go into the transportation market, and maybe not so much the stationary market. I get asked this question a lot. All the utilities are going to want it. Well, on a business case perspective, you should displace the dirtiest, highest carbon fuel first, and that's diesel fuel. It's not natural gas for home heating. So on the municipal piece, they're looking at trying to solve their emissions problems. Municipalities have landfills, wastewater treatment plants. You're starting to see rollout of green bin programs right now. So a lot of these municipalities can make the investments in making their own renewable natural gas and creating their own micro circular economy. So I think transit systems need to talk to their counterparts within the municipalities and seeing, how they can develop RNG production within their own municipality and, produce their own fuel.
Yeah, I'll also start with the electricity piece. I think, Hong, you described it as sort of a solved problem, and in the sense that we have production, we have distribution, we can all get electrons out of an outlet, but it becomes problematic when we start to think of scale. And looking back 5 or 10 years ago, when we first started to roll out I guess prototypes and sort of field tests and demonstrations of our battery electric buses, and we had early adopters taking on 1 or 2 buses with 1 or 2 chargers, and everything in that sense, from a 30,000 foot point of view, works out perfectly well. Now we're in the scale and wrap up phase with a lot of folks across North America and really the world, and getting the amount of power that's needed to a single facility is still a challenge. So there's still challenges in working with utilities. There's challenges in production. There's just challenges with getting that many electrons onto what could be hundreds or even thousands of buses, especially in the larger municipalities. So. And I don't say that to poo-poo the battery technology or the battery electric approach. I think it's all wonderful, but I think it's important to point out that just about every option, you're going to have lots of pros and cons. I feel like that's a theme of how I've answered almost every one of the questions so far. Now, and on the other side, as far as natural gas or hydrogen is concerned, again, lots of pros and cons with it. I guess the biggest con with going the CNG route is I think it's a wonderful transition technology solely for the purpose that we understand it so well. The entire value chain is extremely well known and very well established, but we have the associated emissions, which aren't going to go away. It's definitely, like Joey was saying, is a great cleanup effort when you compare it to the baseline of diesel or heating oils, if you want to talk about residential heating and other applications. So it's great in that sense, but that would be its main challenge there. And then hydrogen is sort of this, potentially penultimate type of solution, but it's very, very much in its infancy throughout that value chain, especially upstream. I get to come on these types of webinars and panels at conferences and things like that and talk about how awesome our fuel cell bus technology is. And I love talking about it, and I love standing by it, and I certainly am now, but that's the downstream part of it. The upstream part of how we produce it and how we distribute it is extremely, in its infancy, and is very, very much behind where we are today with our gas grid. And I think that the gas grid presents a wonderful opportunity to be able to, use it as a foundation to leverage. I know there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of upgrade work, but I think it's a great stone to step on in transitioning from a lower carbon fuel to a complete zero carbon fuel in the form of hydrogen. But that solution is well known for industrial applications, but to get it to work for mobile, it's mobility applications. There's quite a bit of investment and time that's going to be needed, unfortunately. But lots of really great local opportunities. I think it is really much, very much a local story, especially as it relates to Canada. You've got Western Canada with so much oil and gas production. Well, turning that from a carbon-based production and distribution to a hydrogen-based isn't such a big leap. And you have the opportunity of capturing the carbon and turning it from a gray hydrogen into a low carbon intensity blue type of hydrogen down the line, again, with the proper investments. And then as far as the electricity is concerned for production of hydrogen, you've got provinces like Quebec, BC, where I am in Manitoba, where we have a 97.5% renewable grid that's also low cost. There's another great local opportunity for hydrogen production using electrolysis. So we live in a big country and we have plenty of resources and a diverse array of resources. And so it's a matter of how we're going to deploy those to create the value chain in all types of respects. And I won't comment too much on RNG because I know very little about it, but I think Joey did a great job speaking to that.
Thank you. I just want to clarify a little bit about the RNG piece with Joey, and then we can move to some of the audience questions that we've received. So the thing, I'm under the impression that for RNG in Canada, at least in Quebec and BC, most of it is currently being planned to be mixed with the natural gas supply. In Ontario, the situation is not so clear. We're still figuring out how the distribution is going to occur. And you've talked a little bit about how RNG should probably be directed towards higher carbon users and not users like home heating. But so in that case, do you think we can anticipate that most transit agencies, that if they do want to use natural gas buses, would be operating with a mix of natural gas and RNG in their fuel? And how does that then work with the emissions comparison and thinking about zero emissions, even from a life cycle perspective?
Yeah, you kind of laid out how it can be, a sustainable long-term investment, not just an interim one. So making investment in a natural gas station, natural gas buses, and using conventional gas, you're going to reduce emissions by up to 20%, and save a lot of money in fuel. City of Hamilton's probably saving close to around 80 cents per liter in fuel. The nice thing about renewable natural gas is it's not an all or nothing type solution. Switching an entire powertrain, that's a pretty big commitment. Going from conventional gas, you can blend in 1% renewable natural gas up to 5, 10, 50, 100%. It's kind of a drop in fuel. Yeah, so on the business case, my comment towards that on displacing the dirtiest, most expensive fuel, that's just looking at investment on, for the same dollar, what gets you the most carbon reduction. A price per ton. Displacing diesel fuel is a big proponent. This is why in the US, state of California, I believe 98% of their natural gas vehicles is running on RNG. Across the entire US, it's 70% and growing now. We're going to start to see the same thing up here in Canada. And the big piece is these RIN markets. So it's in LCFS markets. But yeah, it kind of sets you up for future proofing. Utilities want to buy it. I know Fortis is buying a lot. Enbridge wants to buy a lot. At the end of the day, it's a competitive market. A lot of RNG producers that I talk to now are nervous about signing 20-year deals with gas utilities. They think they're leaving a lot of money on the table, where I can be selling, they'd be selling their RNG for maybe $25 a GJ for the next 20 years. If they went to the transportation, they might get $40, $50 a gigajoule. So a lot of these producers are also looking at how do they bypass a gas utility. There's companies now that are going to start filling up tube trailers at an RNG producer site and deliver the fuel right to a transit yard, kind of like the for-fuel type model. So it's, utilities will buy a lot of our RNG, but I think we'll start seeing a lot of it move over to the transportation market.
Okay. Thank you. So I do have a question from the audience about hydro energy can be used to create hydrogen, which can then be used in buses, which will mean a total of net zero emissions. Just so like talk a little bit about then how that will work.
Certainly. I imagine you're talking about is using hydroelectricity in places that have hydroelectricity to do the electrolysis process, produce hydrogen and fuel buses. That's absolutely an option. And as far as creating a low carbon intensity supply chain of hydrogen, that's going to be absolutely one piece of the puzzle, and probably the most readily available first option at getting low carbon intensity hydrogen. Right now, we have tons of gray hydrogen out there. We use, natural gas. We release the emissions out right now. There's, a big industry out in Alberta and throughout the world that's, really good at doing that. But probably the next step is going to be using these vast renewable energy reserves that we have, which is very largely hydro-based in hydro provinces. So it's really a matter of the right folks stepping up and creating that supply chain. And we have some examples out there of some transit agencies that have kind of taken it upon themselves to not just be operators of buses, but also producers of their own of their own energy. I'm not too sure if this is, sort of a sustainable or long-term play, or is really just done out of necessity, given that we don't have a developed hydrogen supply chain. But I think that it's wonderful that we have some real pioneering transit agencies out there that are saying, we want to go hydrogen, even if we can't buy hydrogen on the open market, we're going to just make it ourselves. And if we have access to renewable electricity to make it through electrolysis, all the better. We get to, really own that part of the supply chain, which, is pretty inspiring. But down the line, I think that the way that it's probably going to have to work out is we're going to have this gap in the market, and we're going to hopefully have some private players that step up and create the hydrogen industry and create a hydrogen economy to fuel not just buses, but numerous other applications that can run off of hydrogen. But it all comes down to having something that's renewable in place, both in terms of the carbon intensity that's associated with it, and just having it not necessarily be a fossil fuel based. And I think it's okay if that's part of the transition story, but we'll have to have a way to either decrease and ultimately eliminate any emission that's going to be associated with the production at any point in the supply chain, and not just a tailpipe.
Joey, you have anything to add to that?
No, Michael covered that quite well.
Do you have a question about, from a health perspective, wondering whether you can speak on the advantages and disadvantages for electrification and the different fuels on air quality?
Yeah, I can start off. Air quality, I guess the person left it kind of open. There's the tailpipe piece, and then there's, wells to wheels piece. So, if you're burning coal or, natural gas to make that electricity, there's certainly emissions. Maybe it's not at the tailpipe, but the tailpipe is that electric generation piece, and certainly impacts the people who live near those power plants. Natural gas vehicles. Cummins is the main engine manufacturer, has made a lot of advancements in reducing the emissions of their natural gas engines. Particulate matter, I think, is around 90% lower than the current EPA standards. So huge reductions in particulate matter, NOx, SOx. But Michael can certainly probably add a little bit more around the engine side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and even if you're talking diesel compared to where we were 10 or 20 years ago, it's a world of difference. But nonetheless, especially where transit buses operate, which is in cities, so you have a higher population density, there's a lot of concern about air quality there. So we're not just necessarily talking about GHGs here, or we talk about carbon obviously being a lot, but or taking up a lot of space in that conversation. But Joey, you rightfully mentioned the NOx and SOx and that particular matter, which we want to eliminate completely. So in that sense, yeah, 100%. The well to wheels sort of total life cycle of the carbon is very important. But what's nice about having at least zero emission at the tailpipe is we can locate a production plant somewhere where people hopefully don't live or less people live, and be able to clean up our cities in that sense. I think in an ideal world, there's none of that stuff coming out of any tailpipe wherever you may be, but it definitely in sensitive locations like cities or any sort of urban environment, that's a big thing. So that's with anything that's emitting, like whether that's diesel or CNG. But on the hydrogen side, obviously the only emission associated with that is water. So you'll have largely water vapor coming out of the tailpipe there. And we're coming up with some creative solutions for the Canadian environment to be able to mitigate creating any icy types of conditions with our fuel cell buses. That's kind of an interesting story that's sort of on development right there, as we start to see the adoption of fuel cell buses in places that aren't just California, which is largely where it was for the past couple decades when we started deploying these things.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't considered the effect of the water emissions in a cold climate. Is that a challenge that people are facing?
It is right now, and that's it's one of those things where you don't really know it's a problem until you're facing it. So it's not a problem in places like California. If you live in like most places in Canada where you get ice, which is everywhere in the winter, it's not a problem when you are when you're driving around, because you have a couple drops here and there on the road. Freezing is really no problem. But if you're in an idle type of situation, especially when you're working within the bus yard or the bus depot there, and there's the opportunity for it to pool and freeze, then yeah, it can be a problem. But we're not going to need to invent some sort of robot AI to figure this out. This is a very solvable problem, and like I said, we've got some creative solutions around that.
Thank you. But just to clarify one point, and so just aside from carbon dioxide emissions, at least for the natural gas, whether it's renewable natural gas or CNG, there's still going to be some particulate emissions that could affect air quality.
Yeah, maybe Joey, you might know a little bit more about this than I do, but I think that for the challenge was, one of the only remaining challenges with CNG, aside from the carbon part of it, is really just the NOx that you produce in an internal combustion engine. I think the particulate matter is pretty much next to zero. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'd have to pull up the Cummins worksheet on it. At 0.02 grams per braking horsepower. I forget the exact number. Yeah, I don't have the exact figure, so I would have to pull that out. Is it zero? No. Cummins calls it the near zero engine, but yeah, huge advancements in reducing, the NOx and the SOx, and yeah, the particulate matter I think is effectively zero now.
And that has less to do with the actual fuel itself and just the combustion process that's going on. That's simply because you have air intake and there's a lot of nitrogen in the air, and so it's inevitable that when you have a high pressure, high heat, and nitrogen in there, that you're going to make some nitrogen oxygen based compounds in there. It's a matter of trying to attenuate that as much as possible.
Great, thank you. So we do have another question about, in the context of the government of Canada implementing a clean electricity standard, which will require a clean grid by 2035, how will this factor into the emissions intensity of electrification versus other alternative fuels?
In my opinion, I think it's kind of everything. I think that we don't talk, enough about the need of a renewable energy grid as just being sort of the cornerstone to the entire transition process. We talk about EVs a lot. We talk about a lot of alternative fuels, but no matter what, there's going to be electricity input at some point within within that value chain. So I think that it's paramount. And if we're going to be having, mixed fleet solutions, and I'm not just talking about buses, but, really throughout the transportation sector, where we have a number of different alternatives, like I said, electricity is going to play a role somewhere. And so that's going to be an enabler to the ultimate life cycle carbon reduction by having access to clean and renewable electricity as the input.
Yeah, and by 2035, this is a contentious issue. Will it happen by 2035? I wouldn't bet money on it, but from an emissions intensity piece, assume you get there by 2035, yeah, you'd have net zero electricity. However, on the life cycle emission piece, you can, as I mentioned, get carbon negative with renewable natural gas. And a big piece of this is the methane abatement piece. As long as there's humans and animals on Earth, we're going to have all this organic waste. And last thing we want is this methane going up into the atmosphere. It's 80 times more potent from a global warming perspective than carbon dioxide. So these investments in abating this methane from going into the environment and being used, in a natural gas vehicle is kind of how you get to the carbon negative piece. But yeah, are you just looking at the tailpipe? Or are you looking through wells to wheels, the entire carbon chain?
Yeah, and actually, there's a great kind of follow-up to the next question we have about whether there's a risk to warming the atmosphere faster with RNG due to the methane emissions being released when it is burned.
Yeah, it does the opposite. So when the methane goes out, so in a 20-year time period, it's 80 times worse if that methane goes out. If you capture that methane, and then so you're removing all that carbon because that methane's not being released, then you add the carbon to make the renewable natural gas to transport it, and then you add in the CO2, the carbon at combustion, and that's kind of how you do the entire life cycle emission piece. It's much better to be burned rather than going out into the atmosphere. So it actually solves the issue that the person posed, or question that person posed.
Thank you. Okay. We're still welcoming further questions from the audience, but I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about whether you think there are specific areas or municipalities in Canada where you think there is a stronger case to be made for alternative fuels. Are there certain characteristics that they share? Are there specific areas you can talk about where you think, in terms of the relevant factors that agencies should have in mind?
Yeah, maybe I can start off and then you want to follow up, or you go first, Michael, if you like.
No, you can go, Joey. It's fine.
Yeah, municipalities in regions that have electricity have high emission factor, it could make sense. Municipalities that can't get the electricity, doing a 3-5 bus electric pilot is manageable. Yeah, when you do 500, 1,000, and you need megawatts upon megawatts of electricity and you can't get it, the alternative fuels can kind of fit. And then routes, municipalities have a lot of routes that aren't easily electrified, where, instead of just looking at one powertrain, maybe a deployment of battery electric buses paired with maybe some hydrogen buses with some renewable natural gas buses can fit for those municipalities. And we're seeing a huge pause right now, specifically across Ontario. A lot of municipalities were claiming we're going to go 100% electric, and there's a huge pause. An example of this would be the city of Peterborough. They're now doing a full transportation study right now and looking at the entire gambit of different powertrains, when a year ago it was all about electric. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of these municipalities maybe look at how do they use multiple technologies, both in the interim and then kind of set themselves up for the long term.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback onto that. As soon as you asked the question, I tried to think of some examples. But I guess on one hand, I think Alberta is a great example of a place where CNG obviously makes a whole lot of sense. You have the existing oil and gas sector already existing, and so the supply is there. The costs are low, and it just makes sense from that practical perspective. And then the fact that you don't have out in Alberta a clean electricity grid. So if you want to think about battery electric as being a an alternative, and I'm not saying it's not a good alternative, but if you are thinking about the total life cycle of those emissions, you're not able to achieve it by charging off of a grid that's fossil fuel based. So when you if you have a grid that's mostly coal based, then the gains that you get from emissions reductions in going from something like coal to burning natural gas in an internal combustion engine on a bus, those are meaningful gains right there. And so that's a good geographic example of a place where CNG might be a better alternative. And then just sort of to contrast that, look at provinces that are very hydro and renewables rich, like Quebec and like I said, Manitoba, where I am right now. where battery electric can be a wonderful solution to all of those. You have cheap renewable electricity, so the life cycle of carbon is basically a non-factor there, and it all comes down to how good is that technology at solving your application. And the right answer to that might be some combination of battery electric, and you can take some power when you're not charging and use it to produce hydrogen. And I don't just necessarily mean a transit agency doing all this work, but I'm trying to think of the whole global or overall supply chain in that particular location. But you have a player out there that's using off-peak renewable electricity to create hydrogen, and you kind of think of it as just being like a renewable energy store. So you have stored renewables, and then you have renewables that are on demand. So in that sense, maybe a hybrid hydrogen slash battery electric fleet might make sense. So just a couple of examples of how various different solutions can work in completely different environments, and it's all based on what resources you have at your fingertips at any given time.
I am curious about, in a sense, the investment capacity or the financial commitments that transit agencies may be being asked to make. They already have to spend quite a bit of money, I think, as some of you have mentioned, on battery electric buses, on infrastructure. But if we are saying that it's possible that you have to have some battery electric buses, some hydrogen buses, some natural gas buses, in terms of the demand for the servicing, the infrastructure, the maintenance, and all of that, wouldn't that, in a sense, be worse or less cost effective for transit agencies than, as opposed to saying, let's go all in on one type of vehicle? You have more economies of scale that way. It's easier to maintain, easier to train drivers, that kind of thing.
You might be right in a lot of cases, but there's there's practical considerations to take into account there. Like I agree, if you were in a sort of a hypothetical situation where you've never done let's say you have your entire fleet diesel, you've never experimented with any other type of alternative fuel, and you pick a champion and you go all in and you invest all your infrastructure there, and it's kind of a done deal. That might seem cheaper, at least on paper, than having a variety of different propulsion types, and therefore having a variety of different skill sets that you need to have for technicians to maintain them. And those costs can definitely propagate. But really, what we're seeing practically is that that's not necessarily the case. I think that a good example of that would be, one strategy that we've seen a couple times being deployed out in the field with some of our customers that have, reached further on in their ramp up of scaling within their transition plan is, going battery electric is probably a very simple first starting point. And so you can go buy a couple battery electric buses, buy a couple chargers, learn that technology, get very good at it, scale with it, and then suddenly you reach this capacity where your utility might not have any more power to sell you, and it becomes completely impractical to scale battery electric buses any further without making really, really hefty investments, or forcing your utility to make really, really hefty investments that they may or may not be willing to take. And that's when you can look at another transitionary type of fuel, like a CNG or like a hydrogen, to help complement it. So if you think about the total costs of going all in on one technology in this case, so for battery electric, where you need to completely scale up the power transformers and the switch gears and everything to be able to meet a fleet of 100 or hundreds or even thousands of buses, it's actually cheaper to have complementary technologies to solve different parts of those problems at different times.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add on paper, it may seem less expensive to go all in. Risks involved in that. Very recently, Alberta was asked to cut their electricity usage. If everything's electric, that becomes nervous for transit systems if they can't get the electricity. City of Edmonton has got burnt. The bus manufacturer has now declared, I think, bankruptcy. So now they're left with an assets that they can't maintain. So there are risks going all in on one technology and maybe one OEM, where multi-pronged can set up for each other. That'd be the only other thing I'd really add to what Michael's comments were.
Yeah, I think that the key word that I failed to mention, that's an important aspect, is the redundancy. So, when we talk about all these technologies, not talking about them in silos, it's important because of that factor that if you have access to, at least a couple of them, maybe not all of them, then just the energy security that you have for yourself and your fleet and all your assets, it goes up astronomically. And kind of taking a step away from the mobility space, another really good example is just in power systems altogether. And Joey, you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, using natural gas as peak shavers. This is absolutely an important aspect in the provision of electric systems. And I know that where I am in Manitoba, last year we released our integrated resource plan through Manitoba Hydro. That's our Crown Corporation and power provider that relies or is projecting to rely relatively heavily on natural gas, at least in a peak shaving capacity, to do the stuff that the dams can't do at peak demand. And although to my province where we have 97.5% renewable electricity, and we love to talk about how great our hydro electric system is, it can be a little bit of a shock that we could see some pretty some pretty big increases in our emissions, which isn't favorable. But in the name of the redundancy of the grid, and to make the whole thing economical, and balancing that with the greenhouse gas emissions is an important point as well. There needs to be a practical consideration to this whole process before we can get to something that's truly net zero.
I do have a question from the audience about how far off are we from having hydrogen buses readily available? Is there a chance that RNG and electric buses outpace hydrogen and make investing in hydrogen buses unnecessary?
Well, we have hydrogen buses today. We roll them off the assembly line. We're actually, transit is one of these really cool examples that's out there of a very, very mature technology in a space that's often thought about as being, kind of in the experimental phase right now. Whenever I appear at these, like in these webinars or at conferences, I still often get the question of, it'll be really nice one day when fuel cells get fully developed and you guys can maybe put them on a bus one day. And I'm like, we've had these things for a very long time. We've been experimenting with fuel cell bus technology since 1993, actually. So 30 years with really, really rudimentary systems. And we have a very, very advanced product throughout, 3 decades of lessons learned, and also, working in the battery electric space as well, since hydrogen vehicles are still EVs when you use a fuel cell. So we've got a lot of lessons learned in the battery space and the electric drivetrain as well, since those are all integrated parts. So short answer to that question is we have that part today. And I think that that's an important lesson learned, because I think that for a lot of these mobility applications, the downstream part is largely solved. We have the technology, we are able to build it, we're able to support it. That part is the quote unquote easier part. It's a lot of what's happening upstream in terms of production and distribution that are the challenges there, especially as it relates to renewable electricity, and definitely as it relates to being able to produce low carbon intensity hydrogen and RNG as well, and being able to get it to the point of use. So lots of work to be done.
Yeah, I echo Michael's comments. It's production. We own an electrolyzer in Markham, are doing hydrogen blending. Would love for it to go into the transportation sector, but a lot of interest in green hydrogen. It's just specifically here in Ontario, our electricity isn't very inexpensive. So it's how do we start driving down the cost of the hydrogen? A big piece of this is we have a 2.5 megawatt electrolyzer. You kind of need the 20, 50, 100 megawatt electrolyzers, the economies of scale. The technology is coming. I think we're going to see hydrogen prices drop, and New Flyer has buses already, so we'll start seeing more of it, I think.
I'm wondering if I can take a little macro perspective here. As you know, we are running a series of webinars on different kinds of MHDVs and different vocations here. And definitely for the MHDVs, there's a spectrum from easier to decarbonize and harder to decarbonize, right? So long haul freight, things like that. The battery technology is really challenging, and we don't have great solutions for that. So if you're thinking about how to allocate alternative fuels like hydrogen and renewable natural gas, there's an argument to be made that we should allocate them to those vehicle classes as opposed to urban buses where there's a bit more of alternative, where battery electrification is more viable as compared to other classes of heavy vehicles.
Yeah, I'm not a big proponent of central planning. I think the market should decide where fuels go. I think the market's going to decide. Enbridge, we're going through our own fleet analysis. We have a very large fleet across Canada, the United States. I think we're going to see all these technologies in different pieces of our fleets, light duty, definitely electric. We've bought 4 hydrogen SUVs. We have a lot of heavy duty vehicles that we can't get electric, even if we wanted to. So there's a place for, the renewable natural gas fleet. I think we're going to see a lot of the market and the technology kind of deciding, central planning deciding where fuel should go. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to debate that.
And I'll say that, even though I like talking about, global decarbonization and all those buzzwords and great things, but I am coming on this webinar as a New Flyer employee, and therefore I have to represent my customers and hoard all that hydrogen for for the transit industry as it comes online. But I definitely agree with Joey as well, that I think it's going to be a market decision, and working in the transit space, we're leaders in that, simply because we have the technology today. We're able to, like I said, demonstrably produce fuel cell buses and put them out in the field and make them run reliably and be able to support them. So compared to plenty of other applications where, if you want to use, trucking as a comparison, where they're still, building up prototypes and doing trials and all that, and that stuff is great. And I think hydrogen and possibly other fuels would be a great fit for that. If we're producing these alternative fuels and we don't have an application for it, well, it makes no sense to allocate it to those necessarily. We got transit buses right now. We've got fuel cell transit buses, and so as far as something like hydrogen or even RNG is concerned, with our CNG type buses, if we have everything in place right now, why not decarbonize today with that supply?
Yeah, the unfortunate thing that we're starting to see in CUTRIC, the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium's kind of touched on this, that they're kind of seeing this pause, and they're getting nervous where there's a huge push to electrify. Municipalities don't have the money, so what's ended up happening right now is cutting routes. So you're gonna have less public transit, and the last thing you want is to push a technology, and we should have less cars on the road and more people in buses. So it's got to be very careful when you push a certain technology and not think through the unintended consequences of choosing the way things should be.
Thank you. I guess my last question here, unless I see any other further questions from the audience, is, I think looking at the US experience, for example, I don't know how much you're familiar. We recently saw Proterra declare bankruptcy. There are many domestic bus manufacturers that are in great difficulties in the United States. So how should transit agencies think about investing in fleets of buses in a way that's sustainable, that, as you say, maintains their core service and a core mission, which should be about increasing bus use and getting people out of cars, generally, not become overly reliant on one manufacturer?
I mean, a lot of it comes down, it's a top-down kind of decision here. So it's going to depend on, government policy and the government of the day and what they're trying to accomplish necessarily. And, it's going to be some combination of being pro-transit, pro-emissions reduction, and then, of course, their propensity to be invested. So I'm not just talking money here, but I'm talking about resources and exactly what sort of role they're going to play in that process. So one of the things that I find a little bit troubling, and I think that Joey was kind of alluding to it, is that these processes can very, very easily get very heavily politicized. And so you've got, an emperor at the top that says, I want to accomplish this goal, and then puts this very unrealistic expectation down on the people that have to figure out a way to make it happen. And they've been given no guidance as to what that plan might look like. And that's when things can go RE. So I think that coming up with a plan where the priorities are not only set, but the I guess the sub objectives and the details, because the devil's always in the details of what that transition looks like, is realistic, and there's proper money that's behind it. And if that means being a little bit less aggressive than you might be needing to meet what I think can be very aggressive goals in some case, I think that it's more important that we're successful than that we're fast.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add. Treat, I heard this last week at a different conference, treat sustainability like you do business. There is a little bit of a sense of urgency around it, but being technology agnostic and actually looking at what's the most cost-effective way to decarbonize, instead of like Michael alluded to, the emperor choosing one technology. Unfortunately, we're seeing a huge pause right now by doing those type of mandates. So it's take a step back, analyze your fleet, figure out what part you're going to target, and roll out the technology instead of jumping in both feet with one technology and one OEM. Just doing a little more of a cautious yet deliberate approach to it.
Okay.
I'd also like to add, sorry, that it's totally okay if you want to go with one OEM, as long as it's us.
There you go.
I had to give my shameless plug in there.
Nice.
Great, thank you. Now, on that note, I'd like to really thank our two panelists for joining us today and for sharing their expertise and information on this transition and on the role that alternative fuels can play with urban buses. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, this is the first in a series of webinars. So I welcome you and our audience to join us for the other webinars as well, if you have not already done so. There's going to be one, next one on long-haul freight. It's on February 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. 22nd of February at 3 p.m. We'll have another session on regional haul. And then on the 28th of February on medium-duty box trucks. Please feel free to reach out to me or any of our members of the transportation team from Pembina. If you have any questions or want to know more details, registration about these webinars. And again, I want to thank our two panelists here for a great discussion and what I hope has been really informative to all of you. Thank you.